Well-behaved women rarely make history. This quote has been attributed to several women, including Eleanor Roosevelt, Marilyn Monroe, and the academic Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. But in this brief video, I wish to challenge the view that explicit, confrontational, or rule-breaking behaviour is the only form of meaningful activism that people, particularly women, can perform. Looking at the case of one mother living on a housing estate in North London, I will demonstrate that the domestic is also an important site for change. In the next 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to be building on a question of what counts as activism. I will first go over some feminist theories on activism, particularly those developed by Black feminist anti-racist scholars in the US. I will then be using some of my own original research to look at mum and toddler groups to examine how the women who set up these groups were performing a style of domestic activism, arguing that feminist theories must be applied when exploring women's work in the community. So what does it mean to be an activist? Who's an activist and who's a passive onlooker? Where does real activism take place? These are the questions that have been puzzling academics for decades. In relation to women's history in Britain, we have, until fairly recently, tended to place women's activism within a traditional framework. This framework takes cues from histories of male-dominated activist movements, such as the Chartists, or Peterloo, and even the Peasants' Revolt. This is an activism that most of us are familiar with. Large-scale street protests and marches, which are often confrontational, and usually, but not always, isolated to specific dates and locations outside the domestic domain. This has often meant that the female activists that we are most familiar with are the suffragettes or the bra-burning feminists of the 1970s. Feminist theorists have been discussing ideas around implicit activism for some years, and I've included an outline of these theories on this PowerPoint on your screen. This feminist approach reconsiders the local as a site for transformative political action. Deborah Martin and others have stated that the social lives of women in their immediate locality can be political. Local activism, such as support for single mothers or the elderly, tends to be carried out by women as they are traditionally more embedded in the everyday life of the community and are more aware of its needs. They argue that this type of community work is a form of activism because it creates progressive change in the lives of women, their family, and communities. At the heart of this feminist analysis is the belief that women's work in the local area, the so-called expanded private sphere, is not innocuous, but is a form of activism that is as significant as those galvanized social movements that dominate scholarship. African-American theorists have also an important part to play in these discussions. Bell Hooks' concept of home place considers the home as a site of resistance and liberation struggle. In the face of societal oppression, she wrote that Black women made the home a place where Black people were subjects, not objects, and where women, through nurturing the family and the community in the household, could, quote, affirm one another and by doing so, heal many of the wounds inflicted by racist domination. Black feminist Patricia Hill Collins has written on other mothering, whereby women's mothering of other children that aren't hers helps to bolster the Black community in the face of societal oppression and racism. Together, these theories help to delineate a new definition of activism within a, quote, domestic setting. So in recent years, there's been a greater effort to challenge what it means to be an activist and dissect the question, what counts as activism from a historical perspective. Historians such as Krista Kalman and Katrina Bowman have demonstrated that activism needn't take place in the street, on the shop floor, or in Parliament Square, but can in fact take place on the doorstep or in the Women's Institute. So what about when we look at mum and toddler groups set up in the 1980s, particularly those set up in deprived inner city areas, which is my area of research? Can these organisations fit into an activist framework too? I'd like to argue that yes, and I'm going to examine the case of Dolly Kiffin, who was a mother on the Broadwater Farm estate in Tottenham in the late 1970s, to argue that these sites can be a source for political change. This is the Broadwater Farm estate. Dolly Kiffin arrived here from Jamaica in the 1950s, and she moved to the estate in the late 1970s with her family. She was a dressmaker and had a stall in a nearby market. The estate she lived on was notorious for crime. Unemployment was high in the area, and the estate often became a site for crimes including drug dealing, car theft, and burglary that the council were reluctant to address. Moreover, as the physical infrastructure of the estate fell into disrepair, again ignored by the local authorities, very few people wanted to live there. In fact, 49% of residents admitted that they didn't enjoy living on the estate. Kiffin was engaged with the estate's problem quite early on and was already addressing them. In 1981, Dolly had set up a thriving youth association to help deal with youth unemployment on the estate. She'd also set up a daycare centre for local children. However, she was acutely aware of the high number of single mothers living on the estate. On Broadwater Farm, 19% of households were single-parent households, and of those single parents, 64% were from, quote, a West Indian or African background. Kiffin wanted to give these women the social support that they needed, and so in 1984, she set up the Mothers Project upstairs from the day centre. The Mothers Project hosted a variety of initiatives, including a mother and toddler group, activities for Asian mothers, and also Kiffin used her own expertise in dressmaking to help the local mothers by bringing in her own sewing machine and giving them lessons in sewing so they can make their own clothes. But perhaps more importantly, the group could just be a place for women to chat and combat social isolation. Documentary footage, which I've included in this slide from 1988, shows a group of women, white and black, sitting in a living room on sofas, having cups of tea, having lunch, and just having a conversation about childcare. So what was the impact of this local work? On a public-facing level, the success of Kiffin was notable. Her work with the Youth Association and the Daycare Centre had led to a remarkable reduction of crime and unemployment on the estate. So much was her success noted that in 1985, Princess Diana herself paid a visit to the estate. But I think we have to look at the personal here. These groups empowered single mothers to be assured and comfortable in their own singledom. In the documentary footage that I just showed you, we see a conversation. In the documentary footage that I just showed you, one woman tells the camera later that she had got so independent, I think if I did meet someone and they wanted to live here, I don't think I could cope. But I think the subjects of race and racism were also important factors that the mothers group addressed. The black woman who Kiffin was living on the estate with had experienced high racial tension, and between black and white residents, there was a lot of tension going on there, as the previous head of the Tenants Association was run by a member of the National Front. But in these mothers groups, black and white women were able to discuss candidly issues around race and inequality. Discussing the subject of whether white women would allow a black woman to look after their own children, one black mother says to the white mother, quote, "If you got to know me and trust me, you'd be able to leave your child with me." So we see in these meetings where social barriers could be broken down and confronted, producing fruitful and constructive relationships between mothers. I want to also make a point about how Dolly's work expanded the notion of domestic. Where did the lines of domestic exist on an estate where half the residents didn't even enjoy living there? Did they begin on the doorstep, or did they extend to the entire estate? What did domestic mean to a space and a place that was deprived of the qualities that we associate with domesticity, particularly physical and social security? Kiffin's work took place from the estate, yes, but not within her home. But by being located within the boundaries of a residential setting, I still consider her work an important example of domestic community work. So Kiffin, who was once just an ordinary woman who ran a market stall in inner city London, was responding to a situation of social deprivation that her local authority, indeed her country, had failed to address. In doing what she could with very little resources, she was able to support the livelihood of single mothers on her local estate. It was this on-the-ground work of Kiffin that is important and noteworthy in terms of implicit everyday activism. She not only gave women the self-assurance in their singledom, but she also allowed them to confront and tackle issues around race and racism between residents. So therefore, her work is particularly relevant to the work of African-American scholars, as she created a base for local black women to come together and evade the marginalisation that they felt in a racist British society. Kiffin's community work therefore straddles the theories I outlined at the beginning of this video, to do with implicit activism and back feminist anti-racist activism outlined by Hooks and Patricia Hill Collins. Kiffin was a domestic activist because she grafted most days within a residential setting to improve the livelihood of the vulnerable in her local area. Her work was quiet, quotidian, and transformative.